Prime Minister Nguyễn Tấn Dũng attended the World Economic Forum on East Asia 2014. Has Vietnam fallen into the middle-income trap? Hello and thank you for tuning into Bizline, your special economic magazine on VTV4. In this edition of Bizline, we'll take a look at whether Vietnam has fallen into the middle-income trap. But before we get to that question, let's take a look at a review of several highlights from this past week. This week, Prime Minister Nguyễn Tấn Dũng attended the World Economic Forum on East Asia 2014 in Manila, the Philippines. Themed Leveraging Growth for Equitable Progress, the forum focused on the region's development and solutions to ensure its sustainable growth and rising regional connectivity. Addressing the forum, the Vietnamese Prime Minister highlighted the two driving forces of Vietnam's growth, namely international integration and internal reform. He also stressed the importance of public-private partnerships in the forthcoming ASEAN economic community. He also took the occasion to call on other countries to continue backing Vietnam in protecting its national sovereignty and legitimate interest in accordance with international law. State President Trương Tấn Sang on Thursday received senior vice presidents of ExxonMobil, Peter Clark and Raymond Jones, who were in Vietnam to discuss cooperation agreements with the Vietnam National Oil and Gas Group, or PetroVietnam. The guests spoke to President Sang about the work they have been doing with their Vietnamese counterparts and expressed their wish for support from the Vietnamese government to accelerate other cooperation programs this year and trade commitments in the future. Prime Minister Nguyễn Tấn Dũng has adopted a project to innovate state-owned enterprises with funding from the Asian Development Bank, or ADB. The project has a total investment capital of $335 million, 320 million of which will be borrowed from the bank. The scheme will be implemented by the Songda Corporation, Construction Corporation No. 1 and Vinatex. Once the ADB loan is available, the program will be implemented over 3 years by helping firms restructure debts, divest from non-core business, improve profitability and transparency, and renovate management capacity. Foreign banks in Vietnam have appreciated the government's response to the East Sea tension, helping them remain calm and confident, according to the State Bank of Vietnam. At a meeting on Wednesday, representatives from 44 foreign credit institutions in Vietnam commended the government's actions towards the East Sea tension and reaffirmed their confidence to conduct long-term business in Vietnam. State Bank Governor Nguyễn Văn Bình also said that despite the recent developments, Vietnam's financial markets have been functioning normally without errors or disruptions. 5 Vietnamese enterprises have been named among the top 20 most dynamic and high-growth companies in East Asia. They are AA Corporation, Thế giới di động or Mobile World, VNG Corporation, Thiên Minh Group, and Minh Phú Seafood Corporation. The World Economic Forum selects top global growth companies, which are considered trailblazers, shapers, and innovators committed to improving the state of their region and the world. The 20 nominated East Asian global growth companies come from various sectors. All exceed industry standards in revenue growth, innovative business practices, and demonstration of leadership in corporate citizenship. Those are several economic highlights from the past week. Up next, we'll discuss whether Vietnam has fallen into the middle-income trap in our crosstalk. The discussion on middle-income trap has recently been heating up in several economic seminars here in Vietnam. Vietnam has entered the stage of middle-income status since 2008. Although income per capita increased remarkably from $1,086 in 2010 to $1,960 in 2013, there are still some worries whether this trend can continue and Vietnam can avoid the middle-income trap. We're going to discuss this topic on this week's edition of Bizline with Mr. Sandeep Mahajan, lead economist from the World Bank in Vietnam. But before getting his perspectives on this issue, let's take a look at the following.
There are many definitions regarding a middle-income trap. However, it could be understood as a theorized economic development situation where a country which attains a certain income due to given advantages will get stuck at that level. During a recent conference on this topic, many have discussed the emergence of this trap in Vietnam.
Là nhiều nhà khoa học cho rằng là Việt Nam đã rơi vào một cái bẫy thu nhập trung bình nhưng mà ở mức thấp, bởi vì hiện nay thu nhập của chúng ta vẫn còn rất là thấp so với những cái nước khác, gọi là trung bình thấp. Còn trung bình cao nó cao lắm. Trung bình cao là Malaysia còn đang chưa tới 7-8 nghìn, gần đến 10.000 đô la cơ. Còn mình thì chỉ là có 2.000 đô la danh nghĩa và khoảng độ hơn 3.000 đô la ngang bằng sức mua.
Also at the conference, Japanese expert Kenichi Ono shared his views on Vietnam's situation regarding the trap.
I would say that Vietnam is already approaching the middle income situation or has already been trapped. The exact timing of middle income trap is difficult to determine, but there are many signs of middle income trap that has tendencies of slowing down and having problems. One is growth slowdown. Another thing is the wage increase is much faster than labor productivity increase.
Professor Onos, who has more than 20 years of experience in doing research on Southeast Asian countries, also worried about Vietnam's declining competitiveness in the world, as well as some problems as a result of fast growth, such as a wide income gap or pollution.
Well, thank you very much for being here with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Well, first of all, do you think that Vietnam has fallen into the middle income trap?
Right. The estimate of economists at which they think the country reach a middle income trap, they feel that in general the consensus is that middle income trap is reached at income levels measured in PPP terms or purchasing power terms at $10,000 per person. Vietnam's per capita GDP right now in PPP terms is $4,000 per capita. So in that sense, it's not still near the middle income trap level that it has to start worrying. And we can see that there are still a lot of people back in the farming sector, and that movement from farms to cities and to manufacturing sector and to factories is still ongoing, and there's a lot of productivity improvements that can be had from that. So Vietnam is not in a middle income trap yet. It's not close to a middle income trap, but it's something to think about, because the investments that are needed to avoid a middle income trap take a long time to bear fruit, and I think those kind of investments probably can start now, and that might be better.
Slow economic growth, low productivity, and slow process of shifting economic model are some of the signs of a middle income trap, according to Japanese expert Kenichi Ono. Right. Could you elaborate more on this regarding Vietnamese case?
So we have seen economic growth slow down in Vietnam. We've seen productivity growth slow down. It's not relative to other countries. It's actually still fairly high, but by Vietnam's own historical standards, it's gotten lower. Now, the slowdown in growth can happen for various reasons. Falling into a middle income trap is one of those reasons. I don't think Vietnam is in a situation yet where this slowdown in growth is happening because Vietnam is in a middle income trap yet. As for the reasons I mentioned, Vietnam's income, even though it is a middle income country, its income is not close to where countries tend to hit middle income trap. Middle income trap will come when your urbanization rate is already very high, when people have again moved from villages to cities, and that those forces have spent themselves. Vietnam is not there yet. So I think there's different things happening here which have caused the slowdown in economic growth and productivity growth that you mentioned.
What would be the long-term consequences if these conditions continue?
Well, countries that grow slower obviously take longer to become high-income countries and industrialized countries, and that's the risk that Vietnam faces. The faster it grows, the quicker it becomes an industrialized country. And I've been here in Vietnam for 1 year, and I've already picked up that the society is quite keen to become an industrialized country as quickly as possible. So that's the benefit of growing faster. And I think the focus has to be to make sure that productivity growth and economic growth picks up and goes back to levels that we had seen before. And to anticipate that as Vietnam gets richer, at some point it will start hitting the middle income trap, and to start preparing for that as well. But we're not at that point yet.
Now tell us how Vietnam has been warned by the World Bank and other organizations about the scenario of the middle income trap, and what happened after that?
Well, one of the benefits of working in a country like Vietnam is that we don't have to warn anyone. We work with a government which is very well informed. It's not only the government, the academic circles here, the think tanks, they're very well informed. So these kind of discussions have already been going on. We don't warn governments about these things. We have discussions about how countries can do even better. And Vietnam has been a very high-performing country. So I think in our discussions with the government, actually, we have been congratulating the country for its very good performance, and then discussing ways in which Vietnam can probably learn lessons from other countries and continue to grow fast, continue to improve its productivity and economic performance.
Vietnamese government has been trying to stabilize the macroeconomy, and some results that would noting include lower inflation, stable foreign exchange rates, and gold markets. Do you think that these are the foundations, the good foundations for the country to avoid the middle income trap?
I think a stable macroeconomic framework in place is a necessary condition. It's not a sufficient condition, which means that you need it to grow faster, but by itself it's not enough. So I think we are all encouraged that the macroeconomic situation has been stabilized, which allows the government to focus on more fundamental structural reforms to start making sure that productivity growth and economic growth are picking up. I'll go back to my point that Vietnam is not in a middle income trap yet. So it'll be very useful to maintain the stable macroeconomic framework. At the same time, continue to focus on the structural reforms that we have seen the government focus on. That includes the state-owned enterprises, that includes the financial sector issues, that includes focusing on the private sector, which still is relatively small. The domestic formal private sector in Vietnam is still relatively small, and a lot of emphasis is needed on that.
Is the middle income trap inevitable?
It's not inevitable, and we have seen that. There are countries in the region itself, actually, which have been successful in avoiding the middle income trap. You can take the example of Singapore, you can take the example of Korea, you can take the example of Hong Kong, Taiwan. All these economies have been successful in avoiding the middle income trap. So there are certain smart decisions that countries can take which can help them overcome this so-called middle income trap and become industrialized and rich countries.
A study by the World Bank in 2012 found that of 101 middle-income countries in 1960, only 13 had become high-income countries by 2008. Among these, some Asian economies that have successfully escaped this trap include Japan, Singapore, and South Korea. These countries have a few things in common.
Một là họ có một cái chiến lược nhất quán và rất tích cực trong vấn đề mà chủ động nhận diện cũng như là tìm những cái lối thoát cho sự phát triển, và dựa đặc biệt rất mạnh mẽ vào những cái nguồn lực bên ngoài, đặc biệt là thị trường xuất khẩu. Thứ hai nữa là họ có một cái chiến lược phát triển công nghệ, nâng cao khả năng đổi mới và đề rất cao cái nhân tố về con người. Cái thứ ba nữa là họ không câu nặng về vấn đề tài nguyên, mà chủ yếu là tính tới những cái ngành công nghiệp, những cái ngành dịch vụ mà có sở trường, có giá trị tăng cao và hướng ra thị trường bên ngoài.
As for Japanese professor Kenichi Ono, he places a very high emphasis on the mindset of policymakers and the private sectors as making the crucial differences between high-income and middle-income countries.
In Japan, Korea, and China, I think they are very active private sector. They don't need the government's instruction assistance to go abroad and make investments. if they receive policy support, they can do even better. But the private sector itself is very strong.
Other proposals that owner recommended for Vietnam to address the trap are to increase productivity, promote localizations in FDI companies, and create more links between industrial human resources, education, and training.
According to the World Bank, only 13 out of 52 countries in the world successfully stepped out of the middle-income trap. And you have just mentioned several countries, including Japan, Hong Kong, South Korea. How did these countries manage to avoid the middle-income trap?
Vietnam has a lot of things in common with these countries which were able to avoid the middle-income trap, and I think that's a good news. Like Korea and like Japan, Vietnam's strength lies in its people. Vietnamese people, as perceived by investors and outsiders, are skilled, they're disciplined, and they are very productive. Each country's experience is different. I think what they did right was they played to their strengths. And the strength of this region is not in its natural resources. The strength of this region is in its people. And they invested in their people. They invested in skills. They made sure that their population was high-skilled. They invested in ICT, telecommunications. They invested in knowledge, which is very important to make the transition from middle income to higher income, because, as I said, the productivity improvements then start coming from innovation. And for innovation, you need highly skilled people. You need to be part of the knowledge networks, the global knowledge networks. And these countries made those investments. They made investments in their cities. They made sure that their major cities were competitive and they were global centers of knowledge and finance. They did very well in protecting property rights. So that tends to be very important as countries graduate from becoming middle income to high income countries. They made sure that their labor markets were flexible. And that flexibility also tends to be important for countries thinking about avoiding the middle income trap.
Mm-hmm. Which model of these economies is most similar to Vietnam currently?
Each country chooses its own development path. That's one lesson that we have learned from looking at all the countries. Korea didn't follow the path of Taiwan. Taiwan didn't follow the path of Japan. So Vietnam will have to find its own path. I think, again, there are some common lessons that Vietnam can learn and see how to apply them. And again, continuing to invest in its people, continuing to invest in the skills of the people, investing in cities and making sure that Vietnamese cities, Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi, they're globally competitive is going to be very important. Making sure that the financial sector here is sophisticated is going to be critical. Ensuring conditions for the private sector to develop, to take risks, and to do innovation is going to be important. And for that, protection of property rights has proven to be very, very useful. If you force me, I would say that South Korea probably comes closest in terms of where Vietnam can look towards in terms of learning some good lessons.
Why South Korea?
Well, South Korea was 30, 40 years ago where Vietnam is today. And I think there are important lessons to learn in terms of what decisions South Korea took 30, 40 years ago in terms of making that jump. And you see similarities in terms of the people. Again, it comes back to the entrepreneurial culture of the region. There are similarities that neither country is resource rich, it's rich in its people. And we see some commonalities in where South Korea was when it was Vietnam's income level. And then we think that there are some important lessons that Vietnam can learn from South Korea's decisions at that point.
How about Thailand and Malaysia? The economy is more similar to Vietnam.
So that's an interesting comparison, that South Korea is a country which is a good example of avoiding the middle income trap. Thailand is a country which is not a good example of avoiding the middle income trap. Thailand was doing very well for a while, but for the last 15 to 20 years, economic growth has slowed down there. And if you can think of a country which falls into a middle income trap, at this point it seems to be that it is Thailand. So maybe there are lessons to be learned both ways, that you learn lessons from countries which were successful like Korea in terms of what to do, and there are lessons to be learned from countries like Thailand in terms of what not to do so you don't fall into middle income trap. And again, I think the difference is in basic institutions like financial sector institutions, property rights, investing in your people, the skills of the people, higher education, building networks of knowledge, ICT technology. All these things are very important. And these are investments which South Korea did and Thailand didn't do very successfully.
Malaysia?
Well, Malaysia is somewhere in between. I mean, Malaysia is still not a high-income country, but it's definitely doing better than Thailand is. And I think there are probably some good lessons in Malaysia to be picked up. And I think Malaysia has done exceptionally well in building a services sector. And in Vietnam, the services sector is not doing very well right now. Well, it's relatively small compared to its income. And maybe it can look at Malaysia in terms of how to improve and make its services sector bigger and stronger.
So what have been done by the Vietnamese government in order to avoid the middle income trap?
So I think the Vietnamese government has been very active in its policies, not just in the last couple of years, but since Doi Moi. And I think the proof of the pudding is in the eating. I mean, Vietnam has been a very, very strong performer globally. If we look at economic growth from 1990 until today, GDP growth in Vietnam has been second fastest after China. So, that's based on some very good sets of decisions that the Vietnamese government has done. Now, the results are relatively good in terms of, again, maintaining macroeconomic stability recently. In terms of investing in basic education of people, the results are very good in terms of how learned students are in early education. And those things are really encouraging. There are some challenges now that are building up that the government has recognized and will probably need to take stronger action on. And these include actions in the financial sector where we are seeing some problems, looking at faster ways of restructuring the state-owned enterprises, looking at ways to strengthen the private sector and making the playing field level so they don't have an unfair competitive advantage. The SOEs don't have an unfair competitive advantage relative to the private sector companies. I think these reforms are going to be important, but luckily in our discussion with the government, we see that the government is aware of them and is looking for ways to implement the best policies.
Some experts pointed out that what Vietnam really should focus on is productivity and technology transfer to move away from the trap. What's your take on this?
So productivity growth is always important if you want to grow faster and over a long period of time. But productivity growth comes from different ways. When you're not very rich, when your income levels are not very high, as I mentioned at the beginning of the interview, you can get productivity growth simply by moving people and resources from activities which are low productivity, like agriculture, to activities which are high productivity, such as manufacturing. And there's a lot of scope for Vietnam to continue to do that. Over time, this becomes more difficult because as people move to these activities, then there is nothing left to move. So then you need to start investing in getting productivity growth and productivity improvements through innovation. And that's something that takes building institutions, investing in property rights, investing in financial markets, investing in skills of people.
So finally, what are the recommendations from the World Bank for Vietnam?
Recommendations are consistent with what the discussion we've had. That first of all, Vietnam should continue to do what it's doing so well so far, which has allowed it to grow so strongly. The recommendations would be to ensure that the skills of the people continue to improve at a fast pace, to make sure that some of the problems that we are seeing in the financial markets and the financial sector are addressed, that the state-owned enterprises are restructured in a way that increases the efficiency in the economy, that there are encouragements for the private sector, formal private sector, to start developing faster than it has been developing right now. And finally, to look at the potential power of the cities in Vietnam, because in the end, the growth engines are really the cities. And to invest in these cities, to invest in the urban management, and to invest in the urban infrastructure, urban transport, to make sure that the solid growth performance we've seen in Vietnam continues for 20, 30 more years or even longer.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you for having me.
There have been a number of examples of both European countries and Asian countries that successfully escaped the middle-income trap. That means Vietnam can draw a great deal of experience from them to avoid this trap. Therefore, the sooner Vietnam can address its issues, the less likely the country will be stuck in this trap for a very long period of time. And that wraps up our edition of Bizline this week. Simply log on to our website, vtv4.vn, to rewatch our program. Thank you very much for tuning in from our team here in Hanoi. Until next time.